Hello, and welcome to our fifth in our series of webinars with our change leadership partners, Telios Consulting. So this session today is entitled Falter, Survive, Revive and Thrive, Lessons from 9/11. So for those of you who haven't managed to join us in previous weeks, please do get in touch and we can point you in the direction of recordings for those. And for those who don't know me, my name's Andy Nellis. I'm the Managing Director of Coalition 24. Alongside Chris Lever from Telios Consulting, we're very excited and privileged to have with us Clive Triance, who was Head of International Operations for Cantor Fitzgerald and COO of Europe and Asia at the time of 9/11. So before I hand over to Chris, just a little bit of housekeeping. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you like as we go through using the Q&A window. We've also already had some submitted to us previous to this, but we'll pick up as many as we can at the end, and anything we don't cover, we'll actually respond to you directly. So Chris, over to you.
Okay, thanks Andy. It is really a privilege to have Clive with us today. Feels like we've known each other for a long time, but it's actually only 6 months. I was just reflecting that lockdown plays havoc with your sense of time perspective. We were introduced by a mutual friend, Mark Absalon, who said probably we would get on well, which I think we have. We've got a lot in common, which I think we're discovering we have. And we've also got some similar passions. So I want to thank you, Mark, for that intro. So about 6 months ago, Clive and I met in a little bar in Jewry Street in London. And we were just talking about kind of our previous experiences and about that passion which we both have. And that's really about helping leaders navigate the choices and the uncharted waters that many of us find ourselves in, particularly with the kind of shift to AI and robotics and the big data economy. And well, we came from that discussion from different experiences. Clive from very much a banking and finance sector and senior roles, and myself from a previous career at sea, where I was a captain of a commercial ferry, and then latterly in the corporate computer world. So our experiences were different, but there was so much common ground. And of course, at that point, it was before COVID, and then COVID and the lockdown came around. And one of the stories that Clive was relating at the time was how he, as COO of Cantor Fitzgerald, had to respond both in terms of the business and his position, obviously as leader of that business, and also personally as he went through the incredible turmoil that followed the atrocity. And it made a deep impact on me at that time. And then COVID came along, and remembering the kind of lessons and some of the insights from that, we really wanted to get him along to this joint webinar between Cognition 24 and ourselves, Telios, to share some of those insights. So it really is a privilege, and we want to give Clive the floor and as much time as we can. We've got a couple of questions we want to pose to you, Clive, but really want you to take it wherever you feel led to take this discussion. I know there's going to be a lot of really interesting stuff here. So really just want to kick off, Clive, in terms of your response to, we know the COVID pandemic has created new problems and opportunities for firms. And we've heard some talk about the event being kind of the equivalent of a Pearl Harbor, Hurricane Sandy, or indeed 9/11. What kind of parallels are you seeing at this time with our current situation, with what you experienced?
Thanks, Chris. Thanks very much. Thanks, Andy, as well. And hi, folks that have joined. It's an interesting one because I certainly have heard the Hurricane Sandy analogy, mainly used by friends of mine in New York because of the way it's affected the way New York works. And I've heard, like you said, it be compared to Pearl Harbor or a Blitz moment or a 9/11 moment. And the important thing, I think, is they are uniquely different events with their own challenges. But there are definitely parallels that I've been seeing, talking to some of the executives that I work with in firms in London, and even in my own personal family life, when I've been doing certain things, I found myself reflecting there are parallels with my own 9/11 experience. In summary, they would be things like the powerful media images that we are being bombarded with COVID, and how we are absorbing those and dealing with those. Things like revenue challenges for organisations caught up, whether they're small or medium enterprises or large corporations, caught up in this COVID situation where revenue is very volatile. And actually the expense base has become even more important for most organisations. How do they uncouple or manage their expense base when their revenue is so uncertain? I think the biggest reflection I've had is looking at how leadership is reacting during the crisis and how people are understanding how to interact in this new world that's forced on us through COVID. And 9/11 had some similar challenges around how we interacted during the crisis and as we went further forward. I think what is interesting is when we went through the Cantor Fitzgerald terrible crisis for Cantors, we had to think on our feet about the immediate needs that we were faced with, and also how things might look longer term. And certainly organisations that are on the front foot are trying to do that right now. If you had a business plan for 2020, you can tear that up and throw that in the bin. It doesn't have any relevance anymore this year. And I would even suggest if you've got a business plan for 21 or 22, you may as well bin those as well, because the new normal is still finding its way and you need to adapt to that new normal. And that was much like the crisis for Cantor, where we had to adapt to what we had left after the event, the terrible event of 9/11 itself. I think the one other thing that stands out for me really is when thinking about the future, is how well prepared organisations are going to be, or whether they're thinking about this in terms of the emotional burden that is being put on people, maybe without them realising at this point in time. For those of you that don't know me, I was the international head of ops, as you said, and COO of Europe and Asia at Cantors, and as history tells us, 8:46 on 9/11, that terrible moment when the plane hit the first plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center, and my colleagues in the building above the impact zone were trapped and sadly perished. And we lost 800, we lost 658 permanent staff, and we lost 52 contractors. I personally lost 49 of my closest friends and colleagues that I work with. And it was an enormously tough time to be involved in the organisation, to deal with the emotional side of it, the personal side of it, and at the same time being plunged into working out what we should be doing as an organisation to try to ensure we could survive and do the best we could for the families of those affected. You know, we lost our primary data centre in the North Tower. We lost some of our secondary data centre information in the South Tower basement, and we were forced to use our tertiary disaster recovery centre, which was in Rochelle Park, New Jersey. And we really had to think about what we had to use in terms of technology, but also in terms of people. You know, people that were left alive in New York were those that were on holiday, late for work, popped out for a coffee. You know, and the shock for New York was immense. As it was for the international staff, many of them having worked in New York or having close ties with the team in New York. It was tough. I don't think our DR plan, or what history tells us is our DR plan was good enough. You know, the firm survived, but only just good enough. And we had to think a lot of the time on our feet to be agile enough to deal with the complexities of the moment. And that's maybe the first parallel to look at more closely is after this disaster is over, those contingency planners, after COVID, the contingency planners will need to have a good look in the mirror and think about what they've designed for contingency around pandemics. And it's really interesting to see what actually worked. I think that the move to Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Blue Jeans, these technologies have really accelerated, and we've started to discover things we can do differently. I do think in the new world, certainly for the foreseeable future, we won't see the level of business travel that we saw before, and organisations will have to work in a new norm where we've finally discovered how much we can actually do remotely from home. If I was in the business of selling corporate real estate, office blocks for business, I would be a little bit concerned now about that, because I think the new norm will be much more akin to what we're seeing now. The second thing I think that I find as a parallel, and I found myself doing it with my family, is we have we plunged ourselves into watching the news every day at the start of COVID. And after 9/11, something I bitterly regret actually is I was obsessed with the media of 9/11 for a few days, and until the Friday. Actually, what happened on the Friday after 9/11 was the Sun newspaper printed pictures of some of my friends and colleagues that were English, that were working in New York, that had died. And when I saw that newspaper, I stopped looking at the media. I realised that the media doesn't move much in the story. The story's happened. And with COVID, we definitely need to understand the messages. And certainly, this weekend we're going to find out what the first stage of new normal is. But I did feel that we were becoming, in our household, experts at spreadsheets and graphs and numbers on COVID, when actually we weren't learning that much more than by doing it all day long. What we should have been doing was freeing that time up and using that to prepare for what happens next. I guess the third thing is around cash flow and capital protection. Most firms don't go bust due to a lack of capital. It's usually, not quickly anyway, usually it's due to a lack of cash flow. And for us after 9/11 at Cantor's, it was important for us to discover where our cash was being used and make it ourselves as liquid as possible so that we could survive the impacts of the financial services industry and what was going on for Cantor's and other organisations after 9/11. And I know for a fact, talking to people that I've worked with, that organisations, particularly in the airline industry, are having to think hard about where their capital and cash is, how they are making themselves as liquid as possible. I would suggest it's important to fiercely defend your cash position and when you make payments. I would also think the right thing to do, and this was true of Cantor's, is we needed to have really good, honest, transparent conversations with our creditors so that they could understand that it was better for them maybe to receive what they were due later than force us to pay in the moment and maybe not receive anything because it pushed us too far. I would think that that's on everyone's mind, particularly if you're a small or medium enterprise. I mean, the catering industry, restaurants and things. I think the other thing with expenses is if you've got expenses, you can start to alter now. Now's the time to do it. Rent's a great example. If you're tied in for 5 more years on a rent deal, maybe you can change the duration of your rent with your whoever you're renting from, your landlord. And I think if you do that, maybe you can reduce your rent in the short term. So it's about releasing up cash. And the last two, I would say, Chris, are, and this one is particularly important, is what I found after 9/11 was there were 3 types of individual candidates after 9/11, 3 buckets I put people into. There were those that wanted to lead, and they were people that wanted to take on projects, wanted to lead, stepped up, very forceful in wanting to do more. That was about a third of the people. A second third were those that wanted to be led. They wanted to help. And the last third were those that were dealing with the enormity of the situation, dealing with it emotionally, having to take the time to do that. And all 3 of those buckets, frankly, are perfectly normal reactions to a crisis. And I've seen in the COVID crisis of one organisation, certainly in the city, a large one, certain people in that organisation stepping up. And what's interesting about them stepping up is it is not related to the title on their business card, is that they are feeling that they can step up and step forward, and they're falling into where they want to be in the crisis. And as a leader, what you need to do is release those leaders to take on projects and lead, and make sure you're utilising as much of that second bucket, the people that want to do things and be told, so you feel your capacity for what you need to do. And the third bucket, give those people the time to deal with the situation, because they will remember that afterwards and be extremely loyal. And the last thing I'd cover off that I think is a good parallel with 9/11 is the importance to create purpose. This is one that comes out all the time in the discussions I'm having. If you feel like you have purpose, if you know what your purpose is in the organisation during COVID, for me, during 9/11, you feel that you've got a reason to be, a reason to act, a reason to work, a reason to go the extra mile. After 9/11, Howard Lutnick, the president, CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, made a commitment that, if Cantor survived, he would commit 20% of the profits of the firm to the family's fund for 5 years. And that gave us a real sense of purpose. And the organisations right now that are creating purpose, I think they're the ones that will find they get the best out of the situation they're in. I'm watching Barcelona Football Club and what they've been doing around looking after their greater football club, all employees, but actually looking after their community. That should be applauded. And then at the same time on the news, you're hearing these challenges over, do we furlough certain staff, and are the executives keeping their bonuses or salaries or whatever where they were? And those organisations need to have a good look at what the right thing is. This is a time for people to do the right thing. And if you do the right thing, your customers, as importantly, are watching, and your employees are watching, and they won't forget that.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Clive. It was interesting the other day. I was asked, what have we learned through COVID? And I found myself answering that in quite a touchy way, because I think it was too soon for us going through this to actually say what we've actually learned, because we're still in the process of learning. So for you, Clive, in terms of all the experience you went through, what would you consider the most important things that you can generally say that you learned from the 9/11 situation, and how you as a leader came through that with your organisation, that might just be available to people leaders going through the situation now? So things that you can generally say, yeah, I really did learn this, and we may need to take that into account going forward for ourselves.
So 9/11 is a uniquely personal experience for most people. What I do vividly recall before COVID was people would, if you was in a pub having a drink and people would talk about 9/11, everyone has a story. And I personally rarely engaged in that storytelling of 9/11 with people I didn't know, because it wasn't something I felt ready to talk about or willing to discuss, and I didn't want it to be a competition over who had what experience. I felt it was too personal. And this time in COVID, but what I did know during 9/11 was, for me to get the best out of the people around me and myself, I had to become a more open individual. I had to show my real self to those that I needed the most help from, to a point. I think there's a line there, but to a point. And this, I needed, that was a critically important thing for me to do, to ensure that we got the best out of everyone around us. And that sometimes, to my own detriment, my own personal emotional state, it wasn't perfect for me at 9/11, and I'm not sure I'll ever be the same person since 9/11, with the weight that you carry from such an experience. But having those closer relationships that have formed during 9/11, they are the people that I was closest to then. They remain the people I'm closest to now. There is a sense of collective involvement in achieving something in adversity. And what I've seen with COVID is we are suddenly seeing, and this is a happier comment, is we're kind of plunged into each other's homes. We've got to meet each other's dogs and cats, and Chris, you're lovely, building you in there that looks like a bar. You get to see where people are living and how they're living. And I think that has led to a new strength with teams that we need to ensure that we capture going forward. I do think the one thing we did during 9/11, which I'm seeing repeated now as well, is there isn't a time during 9/11 for egos. There was a time for us to agree common goals with our teams. And it was really important to empower the teams so that, and to create a culture during 9/11 where we got something done that was really good, or we learned something that didn't work together, and we collectively shared in that. And I see that again now. And I think the situation with COVID is, well, as we come out of COVID, I actually really think as we're coming out of COVID, the organisations that are beginning already to do wash-ups, already looking fiercely and in serious level of detail of what worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, and trying to dovetail that into what they think the new normal will be. Those are the organisations that will come out with a better level of acceleration. During 9/11, we were dealing with plugging the holes in the dam, but at the same time, we had to think more days ahead than simply plugging the dam. Plugging the dam was making sure we'd survived the first 24 hours from a capital point of view, or the first 72 hours. But the reality was the market was going to reopen. There would be a new world after 9/11, and we needed as an organisation to rebuild our tech and reposition our people to be ready. And I think that's the same now, is the organisations that are preparing now are the ones that will succeed more later.
And by the way, this isn't a bar. I call it my cabin in the woods. My kids are already shed, although the drinks are around the side. So Clive, in terms of preparation and thinking ahead, you've already touched that. What do you think are the priorities going to be for firms after the crisis?
So I think the main priorities. So certainly there is no understanding of what the new norm really is at this point. We're guessing, and each country is busy formulating what that new norm is. But you can bet on some of those points. Firstly, there won't be as many people in as close proximity for some time to come until there is until we can find a way to either cure the disease or immunise ourselves against it. And that leads to thinking around how, as organisations, we will set ourselves up to operate, not for the next 4 weeks, but for the next 2 to 3 years. I think what I'm definitely seeing is there is, when I'm talking to a couple of the banks I work with, there is a sense of shared involvement in a unique event. And I think the way we should look forward with that is, as we come out of the crisis, it is right for us to celebrate, I think it is celebrate, respectfully, with reflection and reverence, celebrate the fact that you've been through something together. I think that is something all organisations should grasp if they can. The second thing is there's going to be a level of, because there's an underlying level of stress that we're all dealing with every day, even if we don't realise it. And when you're in a disaster, crisis, completely different environment, working in unfamiliar circumstances, the reality is you are running with stress in your life. And I think we will see some emotional fallout from this. PTSD type symptoms for some people, when suddenly they can decelerate, take a moment, take a breath and rethink about things. I think the last thing for sure is going on, if you're a small or medium enterprise now, and this is true of Cantor's as well, 9/11, you've got to make very good, tough decisions on what's important to you. You've got to carry a lot of data. You've got to find the right answers for the tough things you're doing. You have to remain calm and considered in this unfamiliar environment, because the outcome might not be what you'd like it to be, but it's got to be the right outcome. And I would say to organisations that they're feeling that they're not going to come out the other side. It doesn't matter if you can't come out the other side as a going concern, you didn't stop being a smart person running a successful business. What happens is you got hit by a unique crisis that changed the shape of the world. You're still a smart person and you'll go on to do great things again. Sometimes when you're in the crisis, it's hard to see fully forward because you're dealing with the immediate issues.
And one of the things which, again, and I asked you in our rehearsals yesterday, Clive, on this, it seems to me that as a leader, you were kind of dealing with your own emotions. You mentioned how many personal friends you actually lost in the North Tower, and keeping focused on the business decisions and keeping the ship afloat, if you will. What insights have you got around that? I mean, how did you handle, Clive, everything that must have been kicking off in you with staying clear and calm-ish, I guess, in the business? How did you do that?
It's really tough. When I was younger, I was taught when you're leading that you do good news, you give good news to people, then you bring the bad news, and then you bring more good news at the end of the meeting because you want to end on a high. And during 9/11, there wasn't any good news. It was just, we were looking for crumbs of good news in a world of pain and emotional strain, and it was really tough. I personally, and yesterday, by the way, we were talking about how honest is honest, and I thought about it overnight, Chris, and I'm not sure if it's about how honest is honest, because I was definitely honest during the crisis with the staff, and I was honest with my bankers and creditors and people, and I was very quick to respond when I was needed by those people to give answers. But I think there is a level of how transparent was that, and what level of transparency works for each layer. If I was seen to disclose all of my fears to the team during the disaster, I think I would have put an awful lot of stress on the team that I was carrying around what the potential outcomes could be and how close we got to very difficult moments in the disaster. And I did that really in a way that kind of broke me later. I carried it myself. And so between September 11th and the end of the year, we were so busy in the office that we were sleeping on the floor and generally just working as many hours as we could. We had a room we set up where we went to sleep for an hour because we couldn't add up anymore. We couldn't add up 3 and 5. Our brains had reached capacity with tiredness and stress. And when we finally slowed down in January 2002, I felt enormously tired. There really wasn't enough glasses of wine to numb it. And that's not a great route to go down. And I felt that there was, I stopped sleeping and I started to have these nightmares of what was going on in those towers, and it wore me down. And I was I was in my early 30s, big, bold, brash kind of guy working at Cantor's. Mental health wasn't something that was talked about back then, and it was definitely seen as a weakness. And I had carried some of this inside me, and a sense of guilt. Chris, you would know, coming from shipping, I felt like I didn't go down with the ship. I felt like I'd survived and it wasn't fair, and I didn't sleep. So in the January of 2002, I finally put my hand up and went to see a counsellor. And even then I kept it quiet. I kept it to myself, but I needed to work out how to make Clive an operating thing again that could survive into the future. And to do that, I had to unlock a lot of the stuff in my head and work out. I think I've told you before, Chris, I had to work out how to build a chest. I think of it as a pirate chest in my head where I would put those emotions and close the lid so that Clive could continue without thinking about 9/11 all the time. And I think that some of that will come out with COVID. I think that, people that have now got their children at home and they're trying to keep their job going and they've got capacity issues. They don't have the perfect technology. They're dealing with the stresses of their organisation that are under pressure financially. I think people are going to have to take a moment. Probably the biggest piece of advice I'd give people, managers and leaders and employees in this disaster of COVID is you're leading or working in an unfamiliar environment. So make sure when this ends that you allow yourself enough time to recover, however much time that is, and find the ways that work for you. And I think organisations should be getting ready for that now and getting on the front foot in terms of offering support and advice for people as they come through COVID.
Superb, Clive. And yeah, it's a tough thing to be a leader, manager, and an employee. Different stresses, and we need to pay attention to that. I'm just aware of our time. Andy, back to you in terms of any questions that have come through for Clive.
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, thanks, Clive. I mean, I found that personally found that really captivating and insightful. So much appreciated that you've joined us today. So we did have some questions coming in during the week, so we'll pick out a couple of those, and I think we've had another number coming in during the course of the webinar. So, and we're probably going to run over on time, but I think hopefully everyone will be happy to kind of just go over a little bit. So if we pick out question number one, I guess open this both to you, Clive, and to Chris. You know, what does great leadership look like now and into the future?
Clive, do you want to pick this up?
I don't mind. Yeah, I wasn't sure if he was going to answer. Look, so there are certain tenets of great leadership that don't change because of a crisis. You need to have humility. You need to be able to add value through your experiences to your team. You need to realise that you hire smart people for them to do the work and tell you their great ideas, not for you to tell them what to do. Nothing ever amuses me more is when we hire great people from universities in my career. We bring them into the organisation I'm working for, and the first thing we do is we give them an email account and a PC, and they're like, why do I need this technology? This is not the technology I live in. I'm from a different generation. So I think the important thing with leadership going forward is we are learning a lot right now about the kind of tech we need to move forward. We're learning a lot, but we don't know enough yet about the new normal, the new world after COVID. I do think when we rewrite those business plans post-COVID and in this new world, we're going to need to make sure that we've listened to our customers, we've listened to our employees, we understand enough about the new world to write them, and then collectively agree on what it is we're going to deliver. I don't think it's a place for a dictatorial management leadership. I think it's for shared values. It's about asking curious questions, but certainly on the customer side, our customers will also have gone through this enormous change, and we need to make sure we're asking the right curious questions so we understand what their priorities are going to be in the next near future, so that we can design solutions to map their needs so they can become more successful. If we do that organisationally, then I think that will help the recovery speed up.
That's good. I mean, from my side, agree absolutely with all that. For me, it's about leaders becoming much more collaborative in the working, understanding that in this complex world, we don't singly have all of the answers. So therefore, that ability to reach out across to people who see the world very differently to us and have the joy of finding out you've got some stuff in common as well is going to be absolutely key. And what my passion is, listening to the WEF who say leaders need to be able to navigate in uncharted waters. I would add absolutely, but first they need to know how to navigate, and that's a very precise set of skills and capabilities, and indeed characters and values that I think we need to be more of. And we're doing some work with Henley Business School basically to equip the new generation of leaders coming through around some of those skills. Andy, do you want to pick up one of the live questions that have come through today?
Sure, let's do that. So I'll just pick a couple out. So we've got one here from Andy Bradford. So could Clive talk a little bit about how he kept communicating with colleagues throughout the crisis to keep them on board, and when did the messaging change from concern for personal well-being to driving business imperatives?
Well, 2001 was a very different world to 2020, and you know, Cantor's is a fantastically brilliant broker, fiercely unforgiving and brilliant, and there was a real challenge between. And it depended where you were in the organisation. In the US, one of my very close friends and colleagues, Tom Trillo, he could have spent all of his time pretty much going to funerals after 9/11 in the days and weeks and the year after. But he chose not to, because he had that purpose that Howard had designed for the company, to try and do the right thing for the more than 1,000 children that had lost a parent from Cantor's. So actually we probably failed in our responsibility to help each other enough in the days after 9/11, because it was so intense and we were so busy that we really wanted to save Cantor's. We really wanted that to happen. So we were driving our business imperatives. We also knew, frankly, that you know, the market reopened a couple of days after 9/11 for trading, and as a company, we'd lost some of the pieces of kit we needed to be ready to open. So we had to redesign and deliver those, and some of those programs operationally can take months or years to deliver normally, and we had a period of 47 hours to fill the gaps and design the solutions. And we had some fantastic technology partners that stepped in, and some consulting firms that stepped in and helped us fill that gap quickly. Now, it wasn't the perfect solution. There was a bit of cup and strings involved to make it work, but it worked, and market reopened and we were open for business. And there's a moment there when, I guess the other thing that we kind of thought would happen was we would open slowly, but people felt so emotionally drawn up in the disaster of 9/11 and the Cantor story that we actually got inundated with new flow. At a time when, you know, we were just about getting the kit to work. So it was a bit of a challenge. It really was a challenge, and it took us some time to really get it working properly. I don't think we were in the well-being message as much as possible. I must tell you that our HR department, led by Peter Lewis, fantastic team there, were probably in one of the worst seats, because they were taking the calls from the families of the deceased. There wasn't a team in New York operating to do that. So they were taking international New York calls into the London office, and they were highly charged, emotional conversations that those members of the HR team had to deal with. And they weren't trained counsellors. They weren't necessarily skilled at that at the time. So I think the wellbeing message is better set up in 2020, better understood, more discussed, more framework in place than there was in 2001. And I think that's great. And I think we need it. And we probably needed it before, but we never had it.
Yeah. So maybe time for one more. So a question here from Matt. So he says he's interested in those that are using COVID to make changes that perhaps they've always wanted to make but had struggled with. Is that something you've experienced and have knowledge of others experiencing right now?
Obama said never waste a good crisis. I've never heard that. No. Well, it depends on your position and where you are on this, right? So are people making corporate decisions now that they weren't able to before? It's hard to answer. You know, the airline industry is making some big decisions to try and survive, and some of those will involve, you know, thousands of jobs and real people in their lives. Were they things they wanted to do before, and could they do them with the unions? I don't know. But these airlines are in such a difficult position. They've got to make them to even be there tomorrow. And some of the decisions we made at Cantor's in the very early days were around cash flow. You know, famously, Cantor's didn't make the US payroll a few days after 9/11 for a few days. But we were in the position at that time of working out where everything was. making sure we could survive as a company. Making payroll, which we could have made, might have left us not able to do things we needed to do to survive, and we just didn't have a clear line of sight. So we took a lot of flack for that at the time, but I think history will show that by not doing that, delaying for however long it was, I can't remember, and finding where everything was and getting ourselves ready was the right outcome.
Okay. I think we've got time for one more. So pick up one from Charlotte. So when leadership is having to make tough, quick and possibly unpopular decisions around furloughs, etc., what are the keys to bringing your staff along with you and getting buy-in, or at least a level of understanding of those tough decisions?
Yeah, if you're going to furlough someone now, you need to have a conversation with that member of staff to explain that. The furlough is going to change quite quickly as well, as we saw on the news yesterday. But I think the organisations have been able to use furlough to lessen the impact of the loss of revenue in most cases for those organisations. And perhaps it's the thing that will allow organisations to keep more people engaged and ready for when things come back. That's why I think it's important for organisations to be doing their wash-ups during COVID now, beginning to really understand now what's going on, because the ones that come out the block quickest, I think there's going to be, just touched on the future with fintech, but organisations coming out of COVID that really understand what's happened are going to be looking closely at a number of things. Firstly, their cost base. How do they change their cost base going forward to map to the new world? Secondly, where can they find revenue opportunities, and who are they speaking to help the other organisations become more efficient? I think we'll see more deals done between organisations. So if you're in sales or relationship management, I think you will have a lot of conversations with your key clients around their future needs. And that, if you've got strong relationships now, you're going to be able to do good deals there to help them and you. I think if you are in the expense side of the business, you're going to have to be looking at how you can be efficient as quickly as possible, because there will be a bounce back. I know we are going to have this deep recession the Bank of England are talking about, but I think next year we could see a big bounce back, and the organisations that are doing those deals today and soon are the ones that will bounce back quickest.
Right. Chris,
I've just got one last question to Clive. When are you publishing your book?
Do you know, I've written a couple of books actually, but I've never published one. And this one on 9/11 I've never published because I never felt, and I've written my personal views down and my thoughts, is I never felt ready to publish it because it was so personal. I have thought about it. Maybe at some point it will come out.
Well, thank you both. It's been a really, really interesting and inspiring session. So really do appreciate your time, Clive, and hopefully everyone's really gotten something from this session. So just kind of remains to say thank you to Chris as well. Just to say we've got another webinar next week, really around how do we support you as SMEs, in terms of the tech solutions and the things that will enable us to grow our business around that. So again, as I said, thank you very much for joining us today. If you do have any questions, and some of those questions we weren't able to answer within the time, we'll get back to you on those. But if you want to get in touch, and then please feel free to do so. But yes, thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys.